Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 4, The Empire and Transition. Okay, the highlights here. Essentially, you guys, we are going from the end of the French Indian War into leading up to the Revolutionary War. And kind of the big question there is, how did we go from loyal British citizens to wanting revolution? And this is kind of the story of that buildup. Okay, so what we have going on in the colonies is this tradition of neglect. The concept is called solitary neglect. Because England is so far away, it's difficult for the colonies to wait for instructions from England. So they are left to primarily govern themselves. And so Parliament, while they have a lot of say, it is really the colonial administration and these colonial legislators that are making the laws. So they have the power to tax, the power to make laws, the power to make appointments. There is a royal governor that's appointed, but that royal governor is more of a rubber stamp in the sense that they don't really veto anything. In fact, their salary is dictated by the colonial legislator. So anytime they might try to do something like that, it could affect their salary. Okay, and so the colonies are divided. There is still this concern about the Iroquois tribe, and so Ben Franklin actually proposed this Albany plan where that they work together to resist the Native Americans. What's notable about this is that the Albany plan fails. Okay, so that this attempt at uniting really fails, but again, in a very short time, that we are actually uniting to overthrow the British. Okay, so what we really have here in North America is this, frankly, calls a struggle for continent, but it's a war for empire. So who's going to dominate? If you remember earlier days, the French are in North America. They're trading with the Native American tribes. They have friendly relations. The British are not. And the French are expanding their trading empire. So they stretch actually down to the Delta in Louisiana, Quebec and Montreal, and all the way down through Detroit and kind of the Great Lakes area. And so there's going to be conflict between the British and French, particularly in the Ohio River Valley area. Okay, so the conflict really takes place in the Ohio River Valley area. George Washington, then a young colonel, I believe it is, um, moves to construct Fort Necessity. They're trying to show the Indians of the area that the British are dominant. The French march onto Fort Necessity, the French and their Indian allies, and they actually force George Washington to surrender. I think they signed a piece of paper admitting that he had started the conflict. Um, Anyways, and we're not going to belabor the French Indian War here, the 1754. There's a struggle. There's a piece of Paris that's a typo apparently on Brinkley's part, so I'm going to blame it on him. The consequence of the 7 Years' War is that the French leave North America. Okay, they turn over their territory to the British, and the British have won and now dominate North America. That's the big takeaway. There's a map. Okay, what the problem is with dominating North America is that Britain incurred a lot of war debt. And it comes to a question, well, who's going to pay that war debt? Okay, and the colonies at this point have kind of grown up, and they are doing very well financially. They're not the little colonies that are dependent on the mother country anymore. In fact, they bring in quite a bit of money. And so they look to them because it was done to protect the colonists and their interests, essentially that they should bear some of the cost of that. The other part of the problem is George III, when he is ascends to the throne, he's only 21. So it's really Lord Grenville that makes this decision the colonists should bear the brunt of paying off the war debt. Okay, one of the other problems that we still have is that as white settlers are moving westward, they keep encroaching on Native American lands. And it actually leads to Pontiac's Rebellion in the Ohio River Valley area here. And so the British are able to put down the rebellion, but to prevent, because it's going to be an expensive prospect if you need to do that constantly. King George issues this proclamation of 1763, and this is important. So settlers should not go west of the Appalachian Mountains, which seems to be a logical line to draw. Geographically, it's there. However, if you remember from earlier chapters that if you wanted to make your way and you wanted to be successful, you needed land. And where would you get land? You had to move west. And now, seemingly with this proclamation of 1763, the prospect for future success is limited because you cannot cross the Appalachian Mountains. There's the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, so how the crown is going to raise revenue? They're going to do it through taxation. So the Sugar Act, Currency Act, Stamp Act. Stamp Act is probably the best known of the bunch. And so the Stamp Act requires that you pay this tax, the stamp tax on any printed goods. So that can go from newspapers to legal documents to playing cards even. And the Stamp Act actually incurs a lot of resistance. The counties aren't unified, but there's growing talk and there's a Stamp Act Congress about how to resist the Stamp Act. And so there's a boycott of goods. And actually, if we skip ahead a little bit, so it's actually the boycotting of goods that leads to the repeal of the Stamp Act. Okay, because it puts pressure on British merchants and they put pressure on the parliaments. But what we also have brewing here in the colonies is this internal rebellion. So the Paxton Boys are in Philadelphia, and if you remember again from earlier chapters, one of the conflicts in the colonies is the conflict between East and West. So on the western frontier, it tends to be poor farmers, settlers that are trying to carve out a piece of land, often encountering Native Americans who don't want to give up their land. Versus the elites on the eastern coast, on the eastern side of any colony, okay, because those folks are already settled. So the Paxton Boys were in Pennsylvania, okay, and they wanted help from the legislator. The legislator wouldn't help them, and so the Paxton Boys actually marched on Philadelphia to burn it down. It's actually Ben Franklin that kind of talks a lot of that. So that's just one of the terms you should know. Your shortcut to remembering it: Paxton Boys from Pennsylvania threatened to burn down Philadelphia and stopped by Ben Franklin. Okay, all kind of that piece on there. Okay, the regulator movement, similar. This is in North Carolina. So again, East versus West conflict. And really what you have of the consequences of this Grenville program is the first stirrings of organized resistance to the crown. Okay. And so the Stamp Act crisis, so I kind of mentioned this in the last slide. Again, they resist. They actually, in Massachusetts, they burned down the governor's home. You get the rise of the Sons of Liberty. Okay, and this is a more radical group. So this is another one of those struggles in the colonies. There are people that want to take more radical actions versus limited actions and boycotts. The Sons of Liberty is helping force the boycotts, kind of thuggish, go around, make sure people don't buy the products. And so then we do have some talks of liberty, and that they have rights that aren't being respected. Okay? So what happens is the Stamp Act again gets repealed, but the fundamental need for revenues and for money to pay off the war debt still exists. And so then they pass these Townshend duties. Actually, after they repeal the Stamp Act, the Parliament passes this Declaratory Act. They declare that they have the right to tax. Okay, just so even though they repeal the Stamp Act, it doesn't mean that they don't have the right to tax. Which then they pass these Townshend duties, and the Townshend duties they feel like they would be more acceptable. Okay, they would be more acceptable because that kind of tax is on the goods coming over before, and you don't actually see the tax. It's kind of like a sales tax. So sales tax, when they tack on that extra 6% here in Michigan, some people resent it because you thought it was only $1, but really it's $1.06. Okay, um, taxes like tariffs that are already built into the price, you don't actually see it, so they didn't think the colonists would be as bad, but they were. And so the Townshend duties, they tax lead, paint, glass, and tea. Okay, those are the major items: lead, glass, paint, and tea. Your mnemonic device to help remember that is there's lead in the paint that goes on the cup, the glass cup, which you drink your tea. Okay, and so again, in response to the Townshend duties, there's boycotts that spring up around the colonies to resist those taxes. And in the meantime, what we have is we have the Boston Massacre. And so part of what the colonies do, they have troops stationed in Boston for the protection. But part of the problem is the troops aren't paid very well. And so in their off-duty hours, they look for work to help supplement their income. Okay, and of course, they compete with the citizens of Boston who resent the British soldiers there. And so what happens is there's a bunch of rabble rousers that gather around the soldiers. They're throwing ice, they're throwing rocks, they're throwing oyster shells, and a shot goes off, and 5 citizens are killed. 5 citizens of Boston are killed. And what the more radical elements among the colonists do is they use this as propaganda. Okay, so it's called the Boston Massacre, not to belittle it, but 5 people being killed is not necessarily a massacre. But if you're in another colony and you hear about the Boston Massacre, it sounds terrible. Okay, and so they're using this to galvanize support for revolution. So one of the fundamental problems that existed is this English balanced constitution. So they always thought there'd be a balance between monarchy, the aristocracy, and the people. Okay, and that they had this unwritten constitution that this is the way just things are done. We don't actually need to write it down. It's just kind of been through practice over the years. And one of the debates that they were having at that time was this idea of virtual versus actual representation. And so the colonists had experience and believed in actual representation. So they got to vote for their local representatives in their local colonial legislature. Okay, whereas the crown felt they believed in virtual representation. So virtual representation is when Parliament and the King decided things, they did it for the good of the empire. Okay, so that you didn't need somebody from each part of the empire advocating for what they need. Whatever decision is going to be made ultimately is for the overall good of the empire. And so that you're virtually represented. You don't actually have to have somebody there fighting for you. Okay, so the tea excitement, the Townshend duties actually all get repealed, but the Tea Act. And the Tea Act actually, this goes to show you how far it's gone. The Tea Act actually lowers the price of tea. It gives a monopoly to the East Indian Tea Company. And so it actually lowers the price of tea, but they resent the fact that they have no choice and they have to drink this tea. And so in some ports like New York, they refuse to unload the tea. I think they even refuse to let the boats come into the harbor. In Boston, Samuel Adams and other Sons of Liberty, they dress up as Mohawk Indians, and they go on board and they dump the tea in the harbor. Okay, I think you guys probably know that from your elementary school days. And this is probably where the point it switches. And so instead of being a debate about what taxes are fair and whether they can tax and how much they should tax, the Crown, in response to the Boston Tea Party, passed these coercive acts. Okay, and they're also known as the Intolerable Acts from the colonist perspective. So the coercive acts dissolves the Massachusetts legislature. They demand repayment of the tea that was destroyed. People that were put on trial will be taken back to England because they don't feel like they can have a fair trial in the colonies. And this is where, again, so the shift is from economic to political. So it's not about how do you raise money, but now it's about punishment. Okay, and it's political punishment. Okay, and so in the significant developments, the colonists all agreed to meet together to discuss what should be done, and so the colonies send delegates to this First Continental Congress. And the only thing the First Continental Congress really accomplishes, they agree to a boycott of British goods until the Intolerable Acts are rescinded, and they agree to meet again. Okay, but it is significant again. So the colonies are meeting and discussing actions as one, as opposed to, so the background question was how did 13 colonies become one unified force to overthrow the British? This is a significant step, but it is also important to notice at this time they're not asking for revolution. Okay, and so in your mind you should have this idea of, well, when did it turn? When did revolution become inevitable? And I think you can plenty of evidence to argue the First Continental Congress is not it. Okay, this is probably a review of your elementary school days also. General Thomas Gage takes some British troops and they're going to march to Concord, where there's a suspected munitions dump where they're keeping the weapons. As they're marching there, they will encounter Minutemen that gather around and will be taking shots at the British troops from behind trees and behind walls and such. And that becomes a shot heard around the world. The first instance of violence. There are, I want to say, just over 70 British troops killed, many injured, but it really is a sign that the colonists are not going to back down, and that really marks the start of the revolution. Okay, so that's the map depicting the route, Lexington and Concord. And that's it for this chapter. So thanks for joining. Don't forget to buy the merch, and we will see you next chapter.